I say being anti-Islam is a good thing. Every time I'm asked that by the press, I'm not embarrassed to say I'm anti-Islam. We shouldn't be embarrassed about standing up for Australian culture. As a matter of fact, Australian culture is better than Islamic culture. That's just clear. Those who breach Australian civil and criminal law, I say zero tolerance. And at the moment we're giving too much carrot and not enough stick. The basic version of Islam, I'm sure you know, and so I'm not going to go into it, but they're not integratable. They come here as isolationists, they set up enclaves. You do not need a 500-seat mosque in Bendigo for the 16 or 20 people that actually go to prayer there. So they're setting up, and they're doing it in Adelaide, and they're doing it everywhere they go. They set up a sort of a super mosque, a community centre, a school, a community around it, within which the women will be expected to be subservient, and all the other things that go with Islam. They preach isolation from the host culture. They're told not to mix with us. The reason why the Grand Mufti of Islam in Australia doesn't speak English after 18 years, every time he doesn't speak English, he is sending the message to his followers that Arabic is the holy language, English is the language of the devil, he refuses to speak it, and he's setting the example. When he comes out and says he's against ISIS, well, Al-Qaeda's against ISIS. You know, it's not a great statement. Because he says he's against ISIS, it doesn't mean to say he's in favour of Australian culture and democracy. So I start off with the zero tolerance to people who breach Australian law. Sexism under the disguise of faith is still sexism, and it's still an offence in Australian criminal and civil law. It's not an exception to our civil and criminal laws to use a quasi-religion in order to breach those laws. Girls and boys have equal opportunity. Those who speak differently need to be prosecuted. Child sex under the disguise of marrying a 12-year-old is still an offence in Australia, and yet 250 child marriages every year in Sydney. One prosecution. The little girl who was the victim there, when she was interviewed, told the police that she told her father, because she had a share of Australian going to school. She said, that's not the law here in Australia. Daddy said, well, you have to, the Australian law is stupid, we follow God's law, you will get married to the 28-year-old. So I'll come to what I say are the solutions about that. Female infant genital mutilation is just a basic breach of a little girl's human rights. It's clearly against the law. It is not covered by the free practice of carrying on a faith here in Australia. It's not an exemption. It's a criminal offence. Now, we have not one but two genital reversal clinics now set up in Australia. 150 women a week are going to these clinics for treatment. Little girls are turning up with pus and all sorts of infections in their private parts because the grandmother does it on the kitchen table, and they will only take the child to the clinic when things get really bad. Now, that's a criminal offence. We've had one prosecution, and yet we have two clinics set up to deal with it. So I say there's no dilemma. There's no dilemma between supporting Australians who identify as Muslim, and there were 476,300 in the 2011 census, 500,000, and obviously since 2011 there'd be more. But 80% of those people probably don't go to mosques and probably don't want to kill me. But the other 20% actually do. They want to convert me, conquer me, turn me into a dhimmi, or kill me. Those are the options that they have, and that's still a lot of people if you talk about 20% of 500,000. Some people say this is just a problem with a new wave of immigrants. You know, we had the problem with the post-war immigration, and I can go through the different countries, you know, the Germans, the Italians, and then the Vietnamese, and there's generally is a period of time where immigrants in a new country do like to band together, give social support, speak the same language, and eventually they do, you know, become part of the community, as every one of those groups that I've mentioned have. But I say this group is different. No other group has ever come to Australia with a deliberate, and I've written this down, deliberate, God-ordained, separationist, isolationist, self-proclaimed sense of superiority, and a totalitarian ideology that sets out to impose their international caliphate on us in their isolationist environment. They are completely different to any other wave of immigrants that Australia's had. Now, as has been said, I go and speak wherever I can, and when you go to a Reclaim rally, you might have a 15-page speech which you've prepared and changed a dozen times before you go, and you've got 1,500 people shouting. And as you reported about one of those rallies that you went to, the trick is to have a very loud speaker system, because then at least you do get some words out. But generally you're not able to put a party manifesto. It's generally preaching to the converted and so forth. Nevertheless, I think the Reclaim Rally has done a brilliant job in assisting in changing the public attitude towards what we do. The next stage, though, and what I do when I'm dealing, for instance, with domestic violence or with Aboriginal equitable shares of mining royalties or children's welfare issues, I don't just complain, I try to tell our politicians the way things ought to go. So what can we actually do about defeating Islam in Australia? How do we achieve that objective of stopping them from converting us? And I say we have to crush Islamists into obedience to Australian criminal civil law. So how do we do that? Well, one way we do it is we gradually get politicians into places of power, but that's going to be too late. You know what's happening in Europe right now. We know Cologne and those sorts of things. Say ALA gets somebody home in Queensland, somebody home in Perth and somebody home in New South Wales. They've only got 3 candidates at the moment for the Senate. Say they get them home. So they'll be up in the upper house, not the lower house. They'll be marginalised. Every time they speak, it'll be, oh, that racist bigot speaking about it. They won't be able to introduce acts into the House that are going to get passed in a foreseeable future time to actually stop what's going on, in my opinion. So I take it the other way as well. Some people in the world like to be told what to do, what to think, what to say, and Australians are not like that. Now, we're not rocket scientists, all of us, or brain surgeons, but we know what freedom is. We know what the Anzac tradition is. We know what a fair go means, although, you know, when you try to define it, everybody has a dig at you getting it wrong. Most of us have never read the Australian Constitution, but we know it's there to protect us. Most of us don't know about the protection that comes from the separation of powers. You know, we have an elected parliament, we have a judiciary that are appointed until they get age and pension off. They're not sacked very easily. And we have the police and other people to implement. We know where to go if we have a problem. We can go to our local member, we can go to the police. So we have avenues of complaining about what goes in our government. Islam knows nothing about this. Islam fights all of those separation of powers. Islam puts one old man in the area, an old man with a beard. He's in charge of everything. He decides what God knows. He decides what the laws are, according to what he thinks God knows. He decides what you do. If you get charged with something, you come before him. He's the one who says you have your hand chopped off or whatever the punishment is. He's the one that decides whether or not the woman is being beaten up appropriately, according to Sharia law, and has provided the husband's told her off first, then he's allowed to hit her as long as he doesn't use too big a stick. But the separation of powers is gone, and that's what they want to bring in here. So we have to attack it on that fundamental basis. In Australia, I keep repeating, our women are equal to our men. Our girls get to finish school before they get married, and our boys are not told if they go out and kill someone, they'll go to heaven. Each of those things are offences, criminal and civil offences in Australia, but they are happening now, and our authorities are doing nothing about it. Now, partly that's because it's quite difficult to prove things. You know, if a little girl turns up to a clinic and she has had her private parts butchered, how do you get the evidence about that when everybody's keeping stum? And that's why there's only been one prosecution, I think. So I draft the rules and say we don't need to change the law, but we need to change the rules of evidence. We need to reverse the onus of proof. If your little girl turns up at a genital clinic because she's been butchered, you're the parent, that's your fault. You're guilty. And so you should be charged, and anybody who's a guardian of that child should be charged, and then leave it. They should be found guilty and they should be penalised, with the opportunity for them to give evidence to show why they did protect their child but it still happened. So we've got to start crushing them to make them obey our laws. Similarly with child marriage, I say reverse the onus of proof. If somebody in the Islamic community is pretending to be married when they're 12 years old, their mum and dad and the husband should be charged, automatically found guilty, unless they can prove they've taken steps not to breach our laws. Let's make it easy to prosecute. Let's crush these people. The Mayor of London right now is actually having a battle to fight against Sharia being equal to the United Kingdom law in certain areas of London, Tower Hamlets for instance. Now, I refuse to sit by and wait for that argument to happen here in Sydney and Melbourne in particular. Right now in Auburn it's 38% Muslim, in Lakemba it's 42% Muslim. They have councillors. We know what the reputation of the Deputy Mayor of Auburn, you know, they had to wait for his dad to get out of prison before he could get married. That's the sort of people that are now taking control of some of these things. I say my starting position is we must never step back from enforcing Australian civil and criminal law. That's all I want. You know, because I'm not infected by this virus of hatred that is Islam, hatred and bigotry, I say that they're the most hateful and most bigoted and most fascist and most extreme right wing of any group you would ever hear, and yet that's what we get called. So wherever we are, we're left of them, that's for sure. But because we're not infected by that sort of bigotry and hatred, I preach tolerance towards ordinary Australian who happen to identify as Muslims. I don't think it's appropriate to approach somebody in the street who looks a bit Muslim and start abusing them. That's not the way we're going to change things. All we do is get bad press. We need to work politically. So I want mosques to be subjected to the same controls as bikie laws. Now, when that young 15-year-old lad